Hey all, welcome. Short announcement so that all of you can decide if you want to stay or not. We have a little change in schedule as there was some hiccup with the time difference between Finland and the Netherlands. So we had to reschedule Sanna's talk for next week. It will be exactly the same time as today, so Wednesday next week at 2 o'clock. I hope all of you will also be available then. So that is about the announcement of Sanna's talk. We just talked to her. It was really a time difference. She wasn't available also for that time. Yeah, my excuses for that. But this is what we're going to do. You will also receive an announcement and see it on the website for next week. So that's the announcement for Sanna's talk. But if you're interested, there is, of course, some works we do at the Center for Education and Learning. One topic we continuously work on is learning analytics. So I have prepared presentation on learning analytics and the current works we do in that area. So if you're interested and you can spend this half an hour, I'm of course happy to invite you to that talk. We just wait a little bit more and then 5 past I do the announcement again for those who join in and then we kick off.
Marcus, you online? Can I quickly ask you a question? Did Nesse forward you the email about a student wanting access to the Minecraft map? No?
Let's talk about it later.
Okay.
Okay, let's get started. I repeat the announcement from the chat. For all external guests, we had to reschedule Sanna Järvelä's talk to next week due to some time differences in planning. But Sanna will give her talk next week 2 o'clock also on Wednesday, so same time slot. If you're available for that, we're happy. Replacement for today is me. So I'm gonna talk about some work we did related to Sana's work in the sense of learning analytics, and give you some of the perspectives and projects we have been working on. The talk is actually a bit longer, but I will shorten it accordingly and take some shortcuts, but not be longer than around 20 minutes or something like that, and then would really open the floor also for discussion. All right. Are all those little badges, I think some are also on video here. If you have any questions in between, just type it in the chat. I monitor the chat, so I'm happy to use that feedback channel also to look at your questions. Before we start, any specific remarks, questions, or anything unclear? Otherwise, I would just start my screen sharing. All right, here we go. If you can see my screen, please give me a thumbs up or a chat. Yes, looks good. So if some of you can see the screen. All right. Last year, I was visiting Sana's lab and gave a guest lecture actually for 1 week. I know she's doing a lot of very interesting work in the field of multimodal analytics, also using multimodal data to analyze collaborative situations. Our work here started from a different angle, but there is some overlap that you will see in the line of this presentation. All right. First, some principal points. Basically, a lot of the works we started, or a lot of the discussions I've been involved about learning analytics is also at some point going to the question, okay, are we driven by data? Are we driven by pedagogy? Or how do we link both to each other? And for me, one example of, where I actually have a typo, sorry for that, of an interesting approach comes from a background also, or is related to a background of inquiry-based learning. Quantified self is a movement from the area of health, and it really follows an inquiry process where you first have a question. By that question, you create already awareness, you reflect about how could I find out if that question is true or false? You start about thinking about operationalization, setting up a local experiment, measuring data collection, and that leads into a behavior change loop in the best case. And this has been done a lot in the domain of health. You see some example on the left side where a person basically tracked activities and color-coded activities throughout the day. So my challenge and question now to you is, what do you think I have to explain, but the rows are the days, and the rows are the days, and the columns is the time of the day. So what do you think, or what would your idea be what this graphic or visualization tells us? Anybody an idea? You can also type the solution or your proposal for the solution. Yeah. Thank you, Rohit. Sleeping time, yeah. Blue is actually the sleeping time. So the person, after reflecting on that time scheme, really thought that he should work on his sleeping hours, which were quite unregularly distributed. And there was no transcontinental flights in between or something. This was in one time zone. So yeah, a sleeping disorder. So this basically follows the process I describe on the right side, like starting up with a hypothesis, a question, or with a question, then building awareness about through self-reflections, doing experimentation, measuring data collection, and probably behavior change. And there are lots of nice examples who do that. And I would postulate that also for a lot of the learning analytics work, at least if you have like, or a lot where the data collection is really embedded into the project, should also follow such an approach where we then, of course, could also think about interventions in the change part that you do from different stakeholders involved. And I give some examples to that in a minute. A second thought, so number one is have a question at the beginning. Number two is think about the yardsticks you're giving. Let's say we did some experimentation with giving students yardsticks for, you should read like 3 pages. Let's say you tell a student, you should read or you need 2 hours to read this article you should work on in the seminar. Then, of course, this yardstick influences their behavior, either in their own perception, their perception of their self-effectiveness, other factors, and so on. But the yardstick you give is an important one. And if you work with social yardsticks, meaning that you take, for example, the average of all the persons, this can be really a difficult context for some of your participants. So number 2, yardstick. I skip those. Then, of course, I mean, most of you are familiar with that. You can use a lot of different types of data when you think about doing analysis. So you can really look at the instructional design of your course, look at what is the relationship. You can analyze the structure, can use data about how students use these course components and see if you have a flaw or a design that leads to a dead end or components that are not used that much. You have social and user-generated data, especially now important in social networks, but this is important information. You have standard tracking data. More and more, we also use sensor data, and I show you also some examples of that. But it goes further, of course, like with contextualized applications, movement and activity data becomes more and more important. And it also goes one level of granularity deeper, using, for example, biomedical sensor data or reading data from eye trackers, or even reasoning data from intelligent systems that analyze program solutions of students. So we have a lot of data available to do analytics and to help students or lecturers further. And typically this is done in supporting assessment processes, doing personalization, supporting reflection of your progress or reflection on your study scheme. Of course, all the work that Sanna will also talk about, self-regulation models and shared regulation models, which are very important then in these processes to enhance your own learning or teaching. You also have very popular apps that do exactly the same. The first one, if you see about repetition strategies, language learning apps as Duolingo or others, they use exactly these kind of repetition strategies to learn factual knowledge, vocabulary, for examples. Another area that recently develops more and more is also using tracking in immersive media with AR, VR integration, and using the interaction in these environments also for analyzing the user behavior. And this, of course, is linked also to simulation and games where we can get a lot of data. And there are several examples of doing this, for example, for mathematics learning, but also for conceptual learning. All right, what I want to highlight, I'll give you as a kind of framework how we are looking a bit at analytics, is that I think we have three stakeholders working together here, or even more. The learner is not alone, but you have learners and peers. You have the teacher, and you have computing systems, basically also using that data. And I show you three different cases per stakeholder, how we use data to support these parts of the system we consider as a kind of ecosystem for a learning setup. So what are the typical cases of supporting learners? Number one, a lot of work has been done on reflection support. Second one, assessment. And the third one I will shortly show is an example for expertise development. So reflection. This is work that is about 10 years old, but you see exactly the example I mentioned before. We embedded indicators in online learning environments, and we looked at how users react to the indicators and the yardsticks we used. So this showed us basically the importance of the yardsticks and how you can frame information, you feedback to the user to help them reflect on their learning process. This was then also linked with a typical question I start up. This is some work from Joanna Givet in the article from her to see how are actually what is the reference frame that is used. So you can frame it with the class, you can see the previous cohorts had that grade or that behavior, you can frame it to learning outcomes or the goals that the users set, or just related to your own progress and settings and the own yardsticks you use yourself. This work highlights and develops further into the importance of autonomy when you use indicators and when you define indicators for learning analytics. And this is exactly then the point where you also link to self-regulation and shared regulation, but I will not talk about this today because we have the expert speaking about that next week. What we also found with this work on dashboards is what are important criteria if you design dashboards and give feedback to users. So it's not only the yardsticks, but transparency is important. You should give the user transparency on how the data is aggregated and how the calculations, what is the algorithm behind aggregating the data to really learn from this information. The reference frame I mentioned, and the support for action. This is also highly stressed by two people we will have talking at our annual meeting, Simon Buckingham-Shum and Elissa Weiss, who really stress the fact that you can do a lot of analytics, can display a lot of visuals to users, but you always must be aware of what is the conclusion, what kind of decisions do you need to take and can take with this information. All right. This is some further work of Joanna, where we then basically gave more autonomy to users to design their own dashboards. and select indicators they want to see to control their own learning process. I skip that. And of course, and I see this recently becoming more popular again, using mobile apps for notifications, behavior change, habit tracking. A lot of this work also was developed in that area. And probably to make one point, linking back to my first slide about the inquiry cycle and quantified self. In this work, we just sent out an SMS message after the school day to students, secondary school students. Every day at 6, they received an SMS message asking them, how did you like school today? And did you learn something valuable? And they just gave us a rating on these questions. And basically that stimulated a kind of reflection and awareness already. And this led to really interesting discussion in the classroom later, stimulated by this point of reflection we inserted basically in the daily habit. All right. I keep this one short. We recently have been doing quite some work. There's also an article upcoming together with Gillian, Gitte, and Vivian's 3 colleagues about peer assessment and peer review. Interesting part for learning analytics is that, of course, in a peer assessment setting, so while the judging or the evaluating student learns a lot, as also that the evaluated students gain insight, but it's a two-sided thing, and you collect data from multiple perspectives on student results. That's I think a very interesting issue, especially if you want to have more detailed data or multi-perspective data on student, for example, essays or student artifacts or student outcomes they produce in a course. The article will be out soon. It's on journal IEEE Education, and we collected there a number of practices and practical guidelines how to set up and possibilities how to set up a peer assessment and foster this evaluative judgment and the development of students and the data you can collect from that. So let me skip through this. And then a third point or a third way how to support students in reflection, of course, is also real-time feedback. We started this work a little bit with the presentation trainer you see here from Jan Schneider, basically collecting real-time sensor data and giving feedback on these sensor data points and the patterns behind to the learner to use for their own adaptation to in the learning process. All right. This so far for the learner. I'm gonna not be too long. Are there any questions or reflections on the part how to use data, learning analytics for learners, things you think I've completely missed out on? What's your perspective on that? And please also speak up. You have a camera and a microphone, so and you can always type in the chat. Okay, if not, I give you some examples for the teacher perspective. Scalable analytics and assessment, augmenting the learning environment, giving new feedback channels, and enhancing feedback for mental models. And I always give one project example on those. In the area of MOOCs, what one colleague worked on, or worked with 2 colleagues on this. This is an analysis tool for MOOCs we are running in edX. And basically, that's a classical way of supporting teachers on let's say, what parts of my curriculum or of my course are often used. You see that in the video transitions. So what are the main paths that students take? On the lower part, you also see the type of paths of learning activities that students take. And in the left upper part of the lower image, you can see that you can filter this according to how successful students have been in the course, or in the MOOC in this case. So you could only look at the paths that students, we now see only the students that have passed the final exam. And we could, of course, also filter that on the students that did drop out. So you get probably interesting habits and patterns of how these people go from the forum to the forum and to the quiz, and how they combine and take paths through the different learning materials. So this is one way supporting teachers' analysis of course usage, instructional material usage, and so on. Another one is enhancing the feedback. This was a master thesis where we basically, let's see if I have another one. Yeah, what we basically did is WebLab is the environment we use at TU Delft for giving a lot of programming courses. And in the back end, we had a system for, it was a course for introductory Python programming. So we had a system that could cluster student solutions. And basically, we could do two things. We could cluster similar students, and we could cluster similar solutions. And this is used in several systems, not only in this prototype, but there are also commercial systems who basically do exactly that, to either cluster students in the sense of that you can group them together for joint discussions, either complementary, that you have students that have solved the problem and have not solved the problem, or you do things that you cluster the solutions or the mistakes that students made, and the lecturer only has to give feedback once, and basically this is then scaled up to give all the students that made the same mistake comparable feedback. So this is a scaling feedback scenario, and then augmenting the learning environment. This is some project where BBAC also was involved. This is a colleague, Roland Klemke, who worked on this project. And basically the idea was really to collect multimodal sensor data and from experts' activities. So, and in a way, you can take the metaphor of recording a video of your lecture, but the lecture is not only two-dimensional, that you have this video afterwards, but I could collect a full performance of an expert. We applied this to medical training. Imagine an ultrasound specialist recording the exact movements of the ultrasound device on a patient, and using this recording as instructional material. And you can scale up the same and apply the same model. Here is another system that BBAC has developed with colleagues, basically applying the same model to a calligraphy training application. So you record the strokes of the expert, and you use that recordings of the expert recordings basically as training data for giving feedback to apprentices. This follows a deliberate practice approach. BBAC will give a dedicated talk to this, so I don't go deeper into that part now. But if you're interested into that, yeah, that's one way where we try also to make lecturer feedback more scalable, but also the creation of educational material more effective. And the last example for the teacher part is enhancing. This is some work with colleagues from the Open University. Basically, in his PhD, Kevin Ackerman worked on developing rubrics that that not only have a textual description of the levels of a rubric, but have a video-based description. And basically, the core problem we addressed here is that a lot of textual descriptions of behavior are really hard to understand, hard to differentiate, especially for novices. So we were interested if this, let's say you want to learn to give a presentation, if to have a rubric that basically has also a video component for the different levels of a competence, that this helps students and novices to develop a mental model, to develop a better and faster develop a mental model to become or develop expertise in this domain. And basically this is what also the data tells us that came out of Kevin's experiment, that you can really make a difference depending, I guess, on the skill or the type of competence you want to develop. But in this case, for kind of 21st century skills, this worked very well. All right, I skipped that part. And now the last perspective, and this is a bit shorter, but I think this is often overseen. I think that learning analytics can give us a really rich data sets for training machine learning models to be used in this triangle of machine learner and teacher. And you can use these things then for different purposes. So this is an example where we basically ask users to read materials and then a sensor system built into an interactive social robot tracked all their behavior. We tracked their eye tracking, we tracked their interactions, nonverbal behavior, and we used that to that data set to train a model to detect attention regulation behavior of users. So meaning as soon as attention regulation behavior of a user appears, the system can now, and this is what we're working towards, probably help and support attention span or keeping up the attention to the learning activity. So on the one hand, we didn't even, we just collected the data basically then for developing a model for giving support. This is basically the classification. This appears in ICD International Conference on Multimodal Learning, running in the next weeks. The same problem here, I come back to one example of the calligraphy trainer. We can, of course, use the expert traces of doing a stroke to give feedback, but only after we develop basically an expert model and developed a model that calculates the deviations between the current student behavior and the expert model. So this is an example where we also looked at that part. One other thing I just mentioned as an overview, because the paper is in the works and we just do a literature review on what kind of methods are used for sequence analysis to analyze the sequence of student activities or learner activities and develop models to help that. So we're more interested then in the machine learning part of that. All right, to conclude, I think that the important takeaway message is really you should probably look at the different stakeholders you want to use learning analytics for. Whom do you want to support? What kind of side effects you can have probably on other stakeholders in the system, and how you can use also the results of one interaction, take the peer review as one example, probably also for the other stakeholders in the setting. All right. Thank you very much. So questions, remarks. I stopped the screen sharing here. Discussion. Do you have other cases that you see important, that we missed out on? Reflections? Open floor.
Thank you, Mark, for the talk. And it was very interesting to revisit learning analytics after a year of time. But it just reminded me of one of the talk, Sana and Perry Dillenberg from EPFL. They both had, and Perry's idea was all these learning analytics dashboards that to say are there so that the student by the end can internalize those and can use them without using these dashboards. And that led me think of this idea that we have such a good dashboards with nice visualization, but we also have different abilities present in terms of learners, which is my PhD right now about spatial ability, how different people analyze the structure in given data set, and that varies very differently from a very early age. So how learning analytics is planning to present information to the users, considering this fact that it's not always easy to interpret those in a meaningful way.
Yeah, I get your point. Yeah. First thing that comes to mind is I know Joanna Givet, I mentioned her before, and Jacqueline Wong now also launched a workshop on cultural embedding of learning analytics, but this is more probably a macro perspective on that. Let me ask you one question. So you talk about the different ways. I mean, you're working on spatial abilities, right?
Yes.
And you say something like different perceptions of feedback, different perceptions of dashboards on that. Can you explain that a little bit more?
Yeah, so just take an example of the question you started with this presentation. So there was a visualization and you asked like what pattern you see in that. Now that visualization, of course, required some kind of prior knowledge about that, and also the way the strategies different people use to find that pattern. For example, what I did was I checked that, okay, blue is more, so blue must be making some sense. Then I thought because it's research data, so it might be have to something do with the daytime, and because there were different colors, so it came in my mind that there are different activities. So actually to analyze that visualization, I use number of other cognitive abilities and my experience, which varies from person to person. And also to identify that structure required some kind of like that's what spatial ability is. So, and it, as I said, it's developed with time. So it also depend how much exposure of these kind of activities you had from early on, so that you can identify those patterns. And then this is the relation that those who have higher spatial ability, they tend to go more towards math intensive STEM careers, which is science, technology, engineering, maths. So on that, I was trying to think on that we can make a very good visualization, but end of the day, they will end up helping more to those who already are good in identifying meaning from these visualization, rather than those who we really want to help in monitoring their performance and improve their ability to learn these skills.
Okay. I think in that sense, what we found, and I showed that on one slide, the work where we gave more autonomy to learners. So probably a interesting direction in that could be, and we also saw that there's some work from RWTH Aachen looking into dashboards for educators. where you basically, educators as also learners could develop their own dashboards with the data relevant for them. And of course, on the meta level, you could look at what they choose to bring people out of their own bubble, so to say, to only develop what they already can do well and challenge them probably into a different direction. But on a meta level, it's definitely interesting what kind of data points users choose and see how they perform on these. So because you might have meta patterns that people only choose the things in which they are already really good and try to have blind spots and neglect what they expect that they do not perform well on. So yeah, really interesting topic, Rohit. So I think it's worth interesting coffee discussion and more to come.
Yeah, definitely, always up for that. But thank you for the talk. It was very interesting.
Okay, others, other remarks, comments? If not, I think this was just the kind of warm-up talk for next week when we have Sana here. So I hope to all see you here next week, and we continue the series. Last thing to mention, this whole talk and also next week's talk of Sana is in the context of a kind of education festival we organized from the TU Delft. Together with several partners at the TU Delft. If you Google 100 days of data, let me type it correctly, data for learning, and I post also the URL in a minute, you'll find the events we're organizing in that series in the next roughly 3 months, all around the thoughts of and different perspectives. So you might hear completely different things than what I talked about today. You for sure will hear different things about that. So that is what is coming up. Hope to see you all next week. And thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you, Marcus.
Thank you, Carol. Good to see you.
Yeah, maybe the other people, I see the cousin is here also from Wageningen University, some other people from the Leiden University. So also it would be nice if you can just share the announcements in your networks and in your community, that maybe more people can join and use this slides. Thank you.
Okay, great. I think for the internal meeting, we can just go for 10 minutes to the Teams room we have. Thanks a lot for being here.